So here we are on the third piece of the blood vessel lecture, and we're going into the veins. And to get us started, let's do a little bit of review from the heart lectures. What was the name of those two major veins that emptied into the right atrium? Which one brings blood from above the heart into the right atrium? That would be the superior vena cava. And then the one bringing blood from below the right atrium would be the inferior vena cava. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about all the veins that feed into the superior vena cava first, and then I'll talk about the veins feeding into the inferior vena cava. Okay, so as you go through this, it's very easy to sort of start from the heart and then go outwards, which is what I'll do. But please remember that these are veins, so actually the direction of the blood flow is going to, it's like a bunch of little rivers all feeding into bigger and bigger rivers and then going back to the heart. Okay, so here we have our heart right there. And then here, this chamber right here would be the right atrium. Feeding into the right atrium is the superior vena cava. Now, the good news is for the veins is that they are more symmetrical. Okay, so they're a lot more symmetrical, so you don't need to worry about those right and left, except for when we get to the branches of the inferior vena cava. For the superior vena cava, their right and left are symmetrical, and so therefore you won't have to designate right or left for your blood vessels. So that's one piece of good news. The other piece of good news is they mirror and they actually follow the arteries, and so most of the time, if you know the artery right there, you'll also know the vein. There is some exception though. Okay, so here we have the superior vena cava. The superior vena cava is going to branch off, and we have the right brachiocephalic vein and the left brachiocephalic vein. Now remember, for arteries, there was only one brachiocephalic artery. For veins, there are two. Each of the major branches are the brachiocephalic vein. And remember, brachio as in going to the arm, cephalic as in going to the head. So the blood vessels that take blood, that drain blood from the head so coming from the arm and coming from the head, I should say. The direction of the blood flow is hard for me to remember. So the blood vessels that drain from the head are called jugular veins, and there are two of them. You have the internal jugular vein and the external jugular vein. For humans, the internal jugular vein is much, much bigger than the external jugular vein. Okay, so the blood vessel that's running right here along the neck, that is going to be the internal jugular vein, whereas the external jugular vein is much, much smaller and harder to find. Okay, so if you ever see one on, like, for example, a picture or a model, the big one is definitely going to be the internal jugular vein. Okay, so now please notice that there's no such thing as carotid veins. Okay, it's jugular instead. Internal jugular vein and external jugular vein, and then coming off of that, underneath the clavicle, running right along the subclavian artery, you're going to have the subclavian vein, and that'll just kind of continue on. And then once it emerges from the rib cage and is now in the armpit region, it becomes the axillary vein, and then that then continues on to form the brachial vein. Now, here's one that is not seen for the arteries. Okay, so the brachial vein is going to travel kind of in the middle of the arm. The other one is the left cephalic vein, and cephalic in this case just means the upper one. And what that does is it shoots up and kind of travels along the top of the arm right here near the shoulder area. Okay, so that would be the left cephalic vein. So let's double check, let's see where we're at. Okay, so again, I suggest that you pause, see if you can figure out these blood vessels, and then we can go through it together. So again, first thing you want to do, orient yourself in the picture. Here is the heart. These are the lungs on either side of the heart. This side right here, this is the aorta. Running on top of the aorta are some veins. Okay, so the big, fat, flattish ones, those are the veins. Remember, flat like a ribbon, those are veins. So going into the right atrium, which is right about here, which blood vessel is the big blood vessel draining into the right atrium above the heart? That would be the superior vena cava. Now, generally, you have to write the word vein. The exception are aorta and vena cava. And the reason for that is that vena means vein already. Okay, so the superior vena cava is going to go into the heart. And then the two branches of the superior vena cava are going to be, both of them are called the same thing, and that is the brachiocephalic vein. Okay, so you have the right brachiocephalic vein over here and the left brachiocephalic vein over there, but because they are symmetrical with each other, you do not need to designate right or left, for this class at least. Okay, so you have the right brachiocephalic vein. Now remember, brachio means going to the, or coming from the arm, okay? And then cephalic also means coming from the head. So you have veins coming from the head, veins coming from the arm, coming together to form the brachiocephalic vein, which then empties into the superior vena cava, which then empties into the right atrium. Okay, so what is the name of the blood, the big one, so the biggest one draining blood from the head? So it's not carotid, that's arteries only. Instead, it's jugular. So that would be the internal jugular vein. So here is the left internal jugular vein. By the way, that one is the right internal jugular vein. The big ones, the first big ones are the internal jugular vein. The external jugular vein is you can't even really see it in this picture. Usually it's much smaller and harder to find. Okay, so after the split where the internal jugular vein is from here, the other side is then called the subclavian vein, which would then become the auxiliary artery. Sorry, auxiliary vein. Okay, so let's go into veins. Oops, trying to move my picture so you can read the words. Let's go into the veins of the arm. Okay, so here we have the brachial vein, and the brachial vein is running in the middle. Okay, so you've got like three veins all running here. Running down the middle is the brachial vein. Running above it in the shoulder region here is the cephalic vein. And then there's a third one running kind of at the very bottom here, kind of where your armpit would be. That is the basilic like base. You've got three veins running through. Brachial in the middle, basilic on the other side, and the cephalic above that. Okay, so remember that the cephalic vein is going to branch off of the auxiliary vein. Let's go back. So the cephalic vein is going to branch off of the cephalic vein is going to branch off of the auxiliary vein, whereas the basilic vein is going to branch off of the brachial vein beneath that. Okay, so they don't kind of match up perfectly right there. Okay, so just remember the middle one is the brachial vein, the cephalic one is the top one, and the basilic is the bottom one. Okay, now these ones right here, okay, if you ever look at your, at your elbow pit right in there, you can see a diagonal shaped one. That is going to be the median cubital vein, and the median cubital vein, cubital as in elbow pit, this is your cubital region right here. And what it does is it connects the basilic vein to the cephalic vein. It sort of like crosses over, and so that the blood vessel at a diagonal, that's going to be the median cubital vein. Whoops. Excuse me. So here we have the cephalic vein continuing all the way down. Okay, so notice that the cephalic vein goes the whole way down and the basilic vein goes the whole way down. They just have that median cubital vein in the middle. I like to think of it like a big long H. Okay, whereas the brachial vein, which is the one in the middle, it stays separate. It's deeper than the other ones, and it has two branches here. Okay, so the brachial vein becomes the ulnar vein, again on the pinky side, the medial side, and the radial vein, which would be on the thumb side. So the ulnar vein and the radial vein are going to run parallel along the ulna and radial arteries. Okay, so draining blood from the hands into the radial and ulnar veins, which will merge together to form the brachial vein, which will then go into the axillary vein, which will then go into the subclavian vein, and then continue on. Okay. Okay, now let's talk about the inferior vena cava. For the inferior vena cava, remember that means below the heart, and so it has to pass through the diaphragm. So the major blood vessel running right along the abdominal aorta is going to be the inferior vena cava, and actually the inferior vena cava, like size-wise, is bigger because remember for veins, the veins have a bigger lumen. So the big floppy one running right next to the abdominal aorta is going to be the inferior vena cava. And the inferior vena cava is going to have a lot of the same branches that we already saw with the other one, with some small changes. Okay, so the first one is going to be the hepatic veins. And remember, hepatic, what does hepatic mean? It means it's related to the liver. Okay, so the liver sits right about here. So the hepatic veins are going to be the first little branches coming up of the inferior vena cava. There are no mesenteric veins, so we're going to jump right to the renal veins here. And renal veins are super easy to identify because the renal veins are going to be coming from the kidneys. Okay, renal means kidney. Then we have the gonadal veins. So remember I warned you that there was one instance of being not symmetrical for the inferior vena cava branches, and this is where it's at. So here is the renal vein. So this right here would be the left renal vein, and this right here would be the right renal vein, and so you don't need to designate those. However, look at the gonadal veins. Okay, so for the left gonadal vein, which is this branch right here, the left gonadal vein is going to come off of the left renal vein, whereas the right gonadal vein emerges directly off of the inferior vena cava. Okay, so this one is just coming off of the renal vein instead of the inferior vena cava. That is what's not symmetrical with it, but because they are not symmetrical with each other, you'll need to designate right or left for that. Okay, continuing on, it looks the same as we saw with the abdominal aorta. The inferior vena cava then branches at the bottom. The branches would become the common iliac vein, and then the common iliac vein, just as we saw before, whenever you see the word common in a blood vessel, that means it's going to split into a internal and external. So the common iliac vein will become the internal iliac vein, and then whatever's left of it is going to become the external iliac vein. Okay, so which of those veins were not symmetrical? All of the veins so far are symmetrical except the gonadal veins. The left gonadal vein comes off of the right renal vein. All the other veins, though, are symmetrical with each other. Okay, that's enough for now. I'll make another one for blood.